Welcome back everybody to Metaphysics. We're continuing talking about ontology, and in this video we're going to start to talk about the method, specifically the Quinean method for establishing ontological commitments. So this is going to be an uncovering essentially of the metaphysical process of discovering and acquiring ontological commitments. Now, there are various processes by which an ontological commitment can be established, but what we're going to be doing is, because of course we're talking about the most famous, most pertinent, and most impactful of the philosophers in this area, we'll examine the Quinean method for establishing ontological commitments in this video, and then talk about it in relation to one of the subsidiary elements of the ontological commitments method in the next video, which is this idea of the use of paraphrase, the method of paraphrase as a mode by which ontological commitments can be established. So we've seen already from the previous lessons that what Quine does is reject the argument for the existence of non-existent entities. Okay, so what do we mean by this? So if we were to see the sentences like Santa does not exist, we're talking about the acceptance of a proposition, this proposition Santa not being in existence, but there is a rejection on the part of Quine for the argument of the existence of the non-existent entity in this example being something like Santa. So we would still accept the sentence, Santa does not exist. The proposition has meaning still, and it is still a truth statement that can be made. But the actual subject matter of this statement, the idea of the non-existent entity being Santa, does not exist. So Santa does not exist is still a true proposition, but the non-existent entity that is included within this proposition, the argument for the existence of said entity, is rejected by Quine. Now, you can understand, on the other hand, however, why people may accept the existence of this non-existent entity in some kind of way, because of course the argument being here is that we can sort of intuitively understand this sentence to be true. And so if this proposition is true, this sentence is true, then does this suggest, therefore, that it has some kind of meaning attached to it? If that is the case, then does this suggest that the meaning, that the idea of meaning is attached to some kind of existence when it comes to the entities in which we are talking about? And then you can sort of wrap some logical argumentation around that to come to the conclusion, essentially, that Santa, being an entity, actually does exist, but does not exist in the same sense that we're talking about in this proposition. All of these things have been talked about in previous lessons. So, according to Quine, just because this proposition is true, and just because this proposition therefore has meaning, owing to the fact that it is true, this does not mean that one must be ontologically committed to the existence of something like Santa. And so the result here is that Quine attempts to establish a view which allows you to have the best of both worlds, essentially. You can accept the meaningfulness and the truth value of a statement like this, while also rejecting the existence of the non-existent entity, i.e. the entity being that of Santa. So you can have a situation where you can accept the proposition's truth value without having to be ontologically committed to the existence of something that we know to be not non-existing. How does Quine do this? How does Quine present this argument? Well, he does so through this idea of ontological commitment. And what he does is uses first-order logic to find the location of and the clear delineation of an ontological commitment. This is a process which Quine calls regimentation. So when we talk about the process of taking a sentence and putting it into first-order logic to discover where one's ontological commitments may exist, Quine calls this regimenting a proposition, or regimenting some kind of idea, which is to the extent to which they want to be ontologically committed to it. So let's take the proposition. If we take S to mean Santa as some kind of entity, let's take the proposition and Santa does not exist, and we can translate this into first order logic, and we find the following sentence. What does this mean? Well, the reversed E, that we see here is actually what is known as a quantifier. It is known as an existential quantifier. In first order logic, there are two main quantifiers. You have an existential quantifier and you have a universal quantifier. What the existential quantifier tells us here is that the reverse E next to the letter X is that there exists some X. And then the next part here is that this X is identical to S. So there exists some X that is S, that is the same as Santa, okay? But the thing is, there is a little squiggle at the start of this here. If we look here, this is a negation sign. So what this is telling us is that you have to take this entire proposition, you have to take this entire first order set, this first order language, and you have to negate that language. You have to come to the conclusion that the opposite is true. So essentially what this is telling us is there does not exist some X and that this variable is Santa. So that there is a variable, some kind of entity that is the S, that means Santa, and it does not exist. So this sentence here in first order logic is identical semantically and syntactically to the sentence that we have above, which is the sentence that Santa does not exist. We have regimented that proposition. The sentence is clearly meaningful, but at the same time does not make any claims to the existence of an object. In fact, it makes the exact opposite claim. It tells us that there does not exist. There is a negation of the proposition that the Santa exists. And so what we're saying here is we have a meaningful proposition, but we are still ontologically committed to the rejection of the existence of some kind of non-existent entity, i.e. that being Santa. So this is really where we get this idea of negating the sentence and how important negation of this sentence actually is. But one could ask, what about the word Santa itself? Because essentially what this is doing is rejecting the proposition that Santa exists. It is suggesting that there does not exist some X that is Santa. But what about the S? We've just assumed that S equals Santa in this particular sentence. And so what does the symbol Santa, the S, represent? Well, it represents the word Santa. But does this suggest, therefore, that the S in this proposition, that the S variable, or the S constant, as it would be described in first order logic, also still has some kind of meaning attached to it? Well, the answer here is that if this is the case, and if S still has meaning, then Quine actually hasn't changed anything. In fact, Quine actually draws upon the work of Bertrand Russell to try and come around this distinction, okay? To try and get over this kind of problem. Because while he has suggested that the proposition Santa does not exist in and of itself has meaning while still does not require us to be ontologically committed to the existence of an entity that is Santa, and he does so by regimenting that proposition into first order logic, as we have seen here, he still has the problem of trying to represent the specific variables within the first order logic sentence in which he has regimented, potentially having meaning to this. And so he looks to the work of Bertrand Russell to try and make this distinction. He claims here that names are simply definite descriptions, okay? So Quine takes the view, Quine takes a sentence, for example, Pegasus does not exist, and we can express this as there does not exist some X that is that we can then therefore represent as being the Pegasus. So one of the things here is we're looking at the idea of a name being a definite description, which is something that Bertrand Russell establishes when he derived a lot of his writings in the philosophy of language. Now, for those of you who want to see more videos on the philosophy of language, we will be getting to that in future lessons time, where we will spend quite a good amount of time discussing and examining Bertrand Russell's theories on the philosophy of language. But ultimately, therefore, first order logic is actually quite useful. It can be very useful in finding a system by which we can essentially have our own ontological commitments, and that we can defend our own ontological commitments quite easily. Simply, we can regiment a sentence into first order logic, and with that translation, we can see that we can find the ontological commitments to existences. Take, for example, the following sentence: electrons exist. Is this regimentable into first order logic? Absolutely. It can be translated quite easily into the following proposition. It suggests that there exists some x, and that the x that exists is an electron. This is known as a predicate. The large capital E is a predicate. It is a characteristic that we assign to the variable. So the variable is assigned the characteristic of being an electron, and that there exists some x that is this electron. Therefore, this is representative both semantically and syntactically of the first sentence here, electrons exist. It tells us, like I said, that there exists some x, and x has the characteristic of being an electron, being E.